Good evening, and welcome to On the Campaign Trail. It's 33 days to Election Day. Since November, we have been trying to make sense of the 2022 elections from a perspective defined by risk. We know that the democratic project is in great danger. It isn't just elections as usual. In 2022, hashtag we decide. Without neglecting the other basic questions, on the campaign trail, we'll ask how we decide and why we decide. I'm John Nery, and you are on the campaign trail. Let me start with a confession. Whenever I hear or read analysts who discuss the still overwhelming lead presidential candidate Ferdinand Marcos Jr. enjoys, without so much as a mention of the organized disinformation campaigns that have been credibly attributed or traced back to his side, for instance by Rappler, I get upset. It simply isn't possible to have an honest discussion of Marcos Jr.'s current political strengths without referring to the poison in the air that emanates from his side. Let me offer a hypothesis. In 1995, Marcos Jr. ran for the Senate and lost with 8.1 million votes. In 2010, he ran for the Senate a second time and won with 13.1 million votes. What happened in those 15 years? My hypothesis, disinformation happened. Or more precisely, disinformation was part of what happened. Tonight, we focus on the poison in the air, not in 2010, but in 2022. Let's talk about the organized disinformation campaigns that have not only turned Philippine politics even more toxic, but perhaps even changed the nature of politics itself. We are joined today by two scholars who have been studying, both directly and indirectly, the problem and the phenomenon of disinformation. It is not the only area of inquiry they study, but they are responsible for some of the leading edge research that allows us to understand the problem and the phenomenon. Fatima Gaw is a professor of communication research at the University of the Philippines. Cleve Arguelles is a professor of political science at Salle University. Professor Gaw, Professor Arguelles, thank you for making time for the program. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting us.
Good evening. Thank you for having us today.
I'd like to start by asking both of you, how much of Marcos Jr.'s high election preference ratings today do you think can be attributed to organized disinformation campaigns that his side runs? Maybe I'll start with Professor Fatima.
All right. That's a very difficult question, John, to answer, especially that we know that this information has been happening for years now. And from Cleve's research, we know, for instance, that, this information or, the rehabilitation of the image of Marcos Sr. has been happening in Ilocos at least for, decades now. And only now the more contemporary version of manifestation of it is what we're seeing online. I think to answer this question, what I want to emphasize is that this information does two things. First, apart from telling you what to believe in, the false narrative, the distorted information that is shared to you about Marcos Jr. for instance, it's really the potency of this information is its capacity to cultivate a schema. Or, in simple words, it's a way of thinking. It's a lens to seeing the world. And having studied this information, especially in the context of historical revisionism of the Marcos regime and more contemporary examples of Marcos Jr. Using this apparatus, I can say that while vote preference is not necessarily something you can attribute to this information, it really is priming the audience to rationalize these lies and distortions. And ultimately, and I think more potently, it's about empathizing with Marcos Jr. I know it's ridiculous to hear that, but if, Marcos Jr. claims to be a victim of, a big cover up, and all of the things that he claims to be, then perhaps, people who've been exposed to this information about his father, his family, and his own political career would probably feel sorry for him for being this victim, right? So I think it's not a matter of measurement, because I think the effect is exponential. If you invest a lot from the very beginning, it would just give you a lot of return of investment, especially in 2022.
Thank you. Professor Cleve, let me ask you the same unfair question. But I really just wanted to introduce the topic. How much do you think of Marcos's high ratings can be attributed to disinformation?
Yes. Hi, John, and hi, Fatima. I think I would agree with Fatima here that I would attribute that one of the significant reasons why Marcos Jr. is leading right now is really because of the organized disinformation campaign. And we know that this is 6 years in the making, if you will, that the family, the Marcos family, has really invested so much on the disinformation machinery that now that they only enjoying the benefits, reaping the benefits of that particular investment. This is I know that this is a contentious position because if you look at the literature on disinformation, scholars are still saying that we are not really able 100% to attribute, for example, election outcomes on disinformation, and this is mainly these claims, for example, are mainly the results of studies on the 2016 and 2019 elections. But I think the way that disinformation campaigns have evolved from 2016 to 2019 to now the 2022 elections, I think it's becoming its significance on the actual election outcome and actual election preference is actually becoming more and more significant. For example, back in 2016 and 2019, for example, I'm part of those disinformation researchers, for example, who would say that disinformation may contribute to the rise of Rodrigo Duterte, it may also have contributed to his electoral victory, but it couldn't really explain his the election outcome. But right now, for example, it's definitely an empirical question. It demands critical and scholarly scrutiny. But because we want to understand what's happening now, my suspicions is based on what I hear on the ground about why people, for example, are not voting for example, the vice president. And if you talk to ordinary voters, I've seen videos. I've also done my own interviews with ordinary voters, and you'd actually hear that the some of the things that are quite popular in the disinformation machine, some of the things that were made popular by the Marcos disinformation machinery, for example, Lenny Lugaw, Lenny Lutang, for example, these were actually also part of the reasons and part of the information that voters on the ground are using on why they prefer Marcos Jr. now more than the other candidates. For example, things like the legacy of the Marcos family, supposedly their investments in infrastructure, their gold, for example, that they are a victim of the Aquino family, for example. These are all narratives that were made popularized online by the Marcos disinformation machinery, and that when we hear it on the ground, when we hear from voters themselves saying that these were their considerations and that these are the things that they know, these are the information that they've considered in choosing who to vote for the president, then I think we are on firm ground here in saying that a big part really of why Marcos Jr. is leading presently is this organized disinformation campaign.
Thank you. Just a quick rejoinder. Of course, we know that disinformation can also take positive forms. One of the things that I'm really struck with is the imaging of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. as mabait. I'm only a few years younger than him. I grew up, a large chunk of my growing up years was spent under the Marcoses. We never thought of him as mabait. We thought of Irene Marcos as mabait. We thought of Amy Marcos as matalino. But Bongbong Marcos, iba yung reputation niya at the time. No? It was certainly not mabait. But now, when you talk about, when you listen to people and they say, oh, hindi siya sumasagot or ayaw niyang lumabas sa debate, ganyan, kasi mabait siya eh. I'm really raring to read a study on that. I mean, rebranding him as that kind of person. Anyway, Professor Fatima, you lead the Philippine Media Monitoring Laboratory's Digital Public Pulse Project, DPP, which has done some really interesting and pioneering research. Can you walk us through the project and then talk about some of your findings that are related to disinformation?
All right. So, Digital Public Pulse or DPP is a big data research. So, what we do is collect tweets, posts, videos, all election discourses online across the biggest platform on the Philippines, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And what we do is three things. First, we map the network of actors engaged in this, conversation. Sino-sino nga ba yung mga driver ng conversation? Second is what kinds of content are being circulated and what topics they're talking about. This kind of analysis is multimodal, or it's not just text but also videos, memes, and graphics, all that circulates online. And then the last is a more cultural look at political participation. What's the culture of political engagement in the Philippines? Has it become uncivilized, or has it become full of disinformation? Now, the project isn't necessarily seeking to look for this information or propaganda tactics out there, but it's a salient thing nonetheless, as proven by previous works by Filipino scholars on the Filipino political landscape. And we found a couple of things. I guess I just want to highlight a few that is relevant to our discussion now. I think the first one is really, we know that fake news has been rampant the past 6 years. And the thing with fake news, it has become, this politicized term. Anyone can just accuse you of, propagating fake news. What we're seeing now is a more sophisticated form, a co-option of the news genre itself. Fake news, kasi they just try to mimic, news elements and pretend to be news. Nowadays, what we're seeing is channels or pages that actually claim to be news, and that's quite interesting because amidst the anti-media attacks, ABS-CBN with Rappler and other media establishment, there is an increasing rise of alternative sources of information and news, and they really try to be salient in this election because it's quite profitable as well, because election is something that has demand in terms of content. So there's that, the co-option of institutional logic. And one of the things also that we saw, maybe something we can talk about later, is not just the co-option of news as a genre, but also the co-option of surveys. I know that historically there are problematic or shady survey institutions that just crop up during the election. Now what we're seeing are more native to digital surveys. So we see those digital surveys where they ask for likes, hearts, and reacts, all of those things to vote for a candidate, and that's easily manipulable because anyone, any troll, any fake account can just like or comment. One thing that we saw are what we call a Calle survey. These are like Vox Pop, man on the street survey. And there are hundreds of them on YouTube, and most of them claim that Marcos Jr. is actually having a landslide win. And the interesting part in this survey is that they go around the Philippines, Bulacan, Iloilo, Pasig, etc. And they do the man on the street survey and claim that the people have actually said that Marcos is their president. So quite, a populist strategy, and it is very relevant to Cleve's research. Another thing that we found would be the emergence of what we call as cloaked political accounts. These are in fact non-political accounts like sports, gaming, or meme pages that has been posting a lot of political content. So you would think, I would encounter politics in news, perhaps in, political commentary on YouTube, but not on these, non-political pages. So we see the boundaries between politics and the outside the realms of outside politics are actually blurring and increasingly penetrated by political and partisan content. And the last thing would be the popularity of what we call as unidentifiable accounts. So these accounts are essentially accounts that we can't verify if they're human. They don't have any posts about themselves, about their families, about their other social accounts. So we can't really know if they are human or they are real people. But the fact that they are they're popular on Twitter and on Facebook as well makes them quite dubious. And from Rappler's reporting, also from the recent takedown of Twitter, some of these unidentifiable accounts are in fact part of the Marcos network. So again, it's really the nowadays the burden to prove that something is disinformation is on the people trying to prove it, not on the perpetrator of this information, and that's what we're seeing now. Different forms, different manifestation, but ultimately it's getting more sophisticated.
I just want to clarify that the first phase of your digital public pulse project ran from May to October last year. That's right. So this covered the period, in the run up to the filing of certificates of candidacy.
Yes. In our more recent findings, we see the same things,
I
perhaps
see.
even more insidious. So yeah, it is a consistent tactic.
What more of the same? One more question, Professor Fatima, about the digital public pulse project. Can you speak of you studied three platforms? Can you speak of the kind of disinformation content that works best on or worst on each of the three platforms?
Huh. Very different forms in each platform. I think for YouTube, there's a lot of influence by content creators, or who we call as influencers or YouTubers. They're the ones who create content about the politicians. And the thing here is that we don't know if they're organic or paid for, because the transactions are behind the scenes, right? So if this would count as political spending, I've heard from several journalists that one influencer is paid 300,000 a month. So imagine how much money is being spent there. So I think they're quite potent because they look organic. They look like
Yes.
testimonials, personal statement in support of particular candidates. So I think that's very potent on YouTube, and they complement what you usually see in the news, more formal, more factual. And then when you go to these influencers, they are more personable, more accessible to the audience. So they make politics, they translate politics in layman's term, and in the context where it is relatable to the audience. For Facebook, there's really a lot of potential manipulation within Facebook groups, because these are more semi-private spaces. What happens is that in Facebook groups, they share partisan content outside of the group to the groups, and then whatever happens within the groups is something we can't really investigate in depth, because it's private, right? Or semi-private at the very least. So I think a lot of it are happening, especially in the Q3 of our research. So it's November to January. We're seeing more groups being activated to create, distribute, and even consume partisan content within these groups. And more likely, some of these partisan content contain this information. For Twitter, what we see on Twitter primarily is the gaming of the Twitter trending lists. We know that Twitter is not the biggest platform in the Philippines, but it has the power to set agenda. So probably if you're an avid Twitter user, you have seen everyday trending by Marcos and even of course Lenny. But further studies is required to see what is organic or not. But at least from the reporting of Rappler and from the takedown of Twitter, fresh accounts that were created to game the trending list is in fact a violation of their community guidelines.
Professor, thank you. Professor Cleve, what do you make of the Digital Public Pulse's finding that years of investment in social media platforms have allowed political groups associated with Marcos and with President Duterte to amass what the project calls entrenched social capital? Does that accord with your own research or with your own experience?
Yes. First, I think I'd like to thank and congratulate Fatima and her colleagues on the DPP study and the project. And I think it's really good that they're doing this particular study because, as she said, yung disinformation strategies there becoming more sophisticated. So we really have to start. Parang it's really hard to catch up. So we really have to do our best in documenting and analyzing them. But yes, I completely agree with the DPP's findings that investments of the Marcos and Duterte groups on organized disinformation online has allowed them to amass entrench social capital. So it's really that in the past years, for example, since 2016, we've really seen the unfolding, kagaya nga ng what John is saying, for example, the unfolding of this new brand of the Marcos family, right? So he's not only mabait, na Bongbong is not only mabait, but he's also the pinakatapat and the least corrupt. And the surveys would show that voters are now saying that he is most trusted, he is least corrupt among the different presidentiables. And if you look back to what they have been saying since 2016, it's actually some of these same things as well, right? I think I also want to relate this with a study I did with Jose Marie Lanuza of UP Manila, Political Science of UP Manila. It's a study funded by the Consortium on Democracy and Disinformation, and we're actually very interested in understanding disinformation online from a media system perspective, right? And I think this relates well to what we're discussing right now. So if you look at the behavior, for example, of Duterte and Marcos since 2016, they have this ecosystem where you have Duterte with control of the state machinery, and of course he himself as the head of state, saying for the past 6 years, for example, that Ferdinand Marcos is a good president. His legacy is about infrastructure, for example. He allowed the National Bureau, the Heroes Burial of Ferdinand Marcos. And then you have the Marcos disinformation machinery on the ground. I mean, by on the ground, I mean online, in infiltrating Facebook groups, creating this fake, not fake, but creating this YouTube accounts, for example, targeting vulnerable internet users. So you have this ecosystem that the assault is coming from the top, but also from the bottom. And so, and for the past years, Filipinos are being bombarded with this positive rebranding, positive imagery of Marcos, also Duterte, no. So and because of that, right now we're at this point wherein they have sort of like a command of the online public conversations, and all the other campaigns, what they're trying to do is just to try to catch up, try to counter, try to sort of change the nature of the conversations. But they really do have a control of these conversations, precisely because it's been a long time in the making. They have invested in this, and it's a very systematic, if I would say, it's a very systematic attempt to really rebrand the Marcos family, and using the state machinery, but also using organized disinformation. And in this way, I actually see that I resonate with the findings of the TPP project, that through this way, you have Marcos and Duterte enjoying so much social capital online.
Professor Cleve, you are also a scholar of populism. In fact, some of your research on Duterte as a populist are must-reads. No? For instance, he wrote about Duterte's other war for control of the EDSA people power narrative. But President Duterte came to power on a train or a jet ski powered by disinformation. Is there a necessary connection between populism and disinformation?
Yes, there is an intimate link between populism and disinformation. I think what's important to know here for our listeners is that populism is a political strategy used commonly by political outsiders because they don't enjoy control of the traditional means of mobilizing voters, right? So, for example, in 2016 and 2015, Duterte is, at least relatively to the other presidential candidates, especially those with national platform, he is relatively an outsider, right? So he had to find a way to mobilize voters without without having access to, for example, local election machineries or huge financial capital, for example. And because of that, social media is actually a perfect platform for populists to mobilize their voters because of the low barrier to the low cost or low barriers to entry, right? This is one of the reasons why, because I've been in my PhD research, I've been talking to some of the key people in the Duterte campaign, and this is one of the reasons why they've considered using social media as a key platform for their campaign. It's because of the cost, right? Because they don't have access to so much money, at least again relatively to the other candidates during that time. So that's one of the reasons why populism and disinformation is intimately linked, because they want to take advantage of the social media, of the online landscape, right, to mobilize voters. The other reason is that populists usually also rely on a very polarizing discourse of us versus them, of the good versus the evil, of maligning certain social groups in the society. For example, the drug users, in the case of the Duterte, the so-called Dilawan, for example. So we keep hearing about this. And social media, social media, as we've seen in many studies, is shown to be a platform that is also polarizing on its own, right? So even without populism, for example, if you take away populism, we know that because of the algorithm, because of how social media is built, for example, what kinds of conversations are rewarded, what kinds of stories are shown on your feed, right? It enables, for example, polarization, and that kind of polarized discourse. So if imagine if you have a populist that wishes to take advantage of that already quite polarized environment, then you really see the intimate link between populism and disinformation. So.
Thank you. Professor Fatima, what does your own research suggest to you about populism or the populist uses of disinformation?
Sure. We are still doing, the content analysis part of our researches. It's, millions of data points now. But from my previous research, I think I can comment on that. Similar to what Cleve mentioned, populism have several salient, characteristic, and I can echo that. One of it that emerged in our data and in previous research, especially on YouTube, is the fact that these misinformation actors are in fact representing the majority or the public. They always invoke that a lot of people believe this, that majority of the people support President Duterte. There's always that call for ordinary users watching the videos, reading the content to belong to their rhetoric. You're saying that, hey, you are part of this. Majority of us are actually supportive of Marcos or believing Duterte's, ideology or legacy, for instance. Another one that is quite salient in our research is the vilification of enemies. So there are a couple of enemies here, and if you are, for media students here, it's a common strategy in media to have an enemy. So that's essentially the media, the elite, for instance, and something that populism research exactly highlights. It's the majority of the people, the public versus the elite. We also see, I guess, new enemies emerging, like anyone who opposes the Duterte administration, for instance, or the Marcoses, are already tagged as an enemy here, celebrities or influencers. An observation, in fact, remember during, I think, the Q2 of our study, and it's essentially the fallout of the alliance between the Rodrigo Duterte at the very least, and Marcos Jr. We see that some of the influencers that they've been working with actually are choosing camps. Suddenly the Duterte influencer are promoting Marcos Jr. and vice versa, and they're actually creating, vilifying each other. You're creating enemies out of each other. That's possibly a good thing for those who doesn't want Marcos Jr. to win the presidency because it is destabilizing, their seemingly solid voter base. But at the same time, it is exactly that kind of bickering and vilification and, campaign smearing that's happening online that is a backbone of populism. It's always is the boundaries being set versus us and them. And the last one, I think that is something that might be more difficult to see in the data, but we are seeing patterns of this, is what I call as a moral ascendancy claim by these disinformation actors. For instance, they always would rationalize political actions or decisions of Marcos or Duterte as morally just. It's something that they, considered for a long time. It's something out of, genuine intent. So whatever they do, people would this information peddlers would just rationalize. Sara Duterte is running for VP because she wants to learn more. She doesn't want to inherit the kingdom from his father. And I'm quoting actual videos here. I'm gonna present in 2 weeks this research. And for example, conceding that there's corruption in the government, but Duterte is not involved in that. He's actually fighting corruption. Another thing we saw that that projects moral ascendancy would be, don't judge Marcos. You don't have an evidence, even gaslighting voters that, you're not saying an opinion, you're accusing. And that the people saying that Marcos is a magnanakaw or a thief essentially are, accusatory and have malign intent. So ang galing, no? Nagkakaroon tayo ng morally just actors and morally corrupt actors. And essentially, again, that division that is very much character of populist politics.
Thank you. A question now for the both of you, which is close to my heart as a journalist. Mainstream media own some of the biggest properties on digital and social media. Some of the biggest names there. And in fact, the DPP project finds that mainstream news media outlets, to use their word, tower above above the landscape in particular platforms. But however, they carry only limited influence. Why is this so, and how did we reach this state of affairs, and what does this imply for the elections in a month's time? Maybe Professor Cleve first, and then Professor Fatima.
Yes. Yeah, I think we have a team. We have a team for this election. We try to follow the reach and engagement of the different presidential candidates in the mainstream pages, mainstream media pages, for example, and other kinds of pages in social media, most especially on Facebook. And definitely, as the DPP study revealed, the mainstream media pages will always carry the most number of reach and engagements, right? So it's still unbeatable, right? But I think what is really interesting here is that aside from the mainstream media pages, there are also other alternative centers of engagement in reach that we can find online. So one example would be those who say that they are alternative media, and they would not get the same number of engagements. They would not get the same number of reach. I mean, at least generally, from time to time they do, but generally they don't, right? But they have this ability to, I think, what differentiates is that they have their own community. They have this niche community. They are able to influence the conversations that this particular community is having, essentially shaping their worldview, and their sources of information, right? So I think when you have mainstream media outlets having their own social media, they do enjoy big reach and big engagement. But because the logic of mass media is quite different with how social media works, for example, how you're supposed to really have this niche community. You're really supposed to take care of this community, engage them on a very personal level, right? It's as if the alternative media outlets are also behaving like influencers, right? Think of outlets like Thinking Pinoy, for example, right? So because of this kind of because they are able to maximize and take advantage the logic of social media, I think they also pose as alternative centers of influence online.
We're running long, so I'm going to skip some of the questions that I prepared. Professor
Yeah.
Fatima, your research talks of discovering new political intermediaries in the three platforms that you studied: YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. How do these new intermediaries shape the election landscape today?
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of official and non-official campaigners for politicians. You have the influencers, for instance, the channels, the pages. And the thing is, these intermediaries are not new. In 2016, Duterte has used them. We knew of the twin mark hiring of influencers, right, by the Duterte administration, the use of trolls, the use of disinformation. The thing with intermediaries is that they really serve as a proxy source of information, similar to what Cleve is saying earlier. Because there's heightened distrust with media, there's also the demand for alternative sources of information. And he mentioned that relatability factor, that they speak the language that the mass uses or is relate to. Ultimately, they serve as brokers for the candidates. We know in on the ground in non-digital campaigning, there are tagapamagitan or intermediaries or brokers, barangay captains, local politicians for the national candidates, and the same individuals serve the same role of brokering the political agenda of the candidates to their voters, except that it's an online space. And I think the thing is, if on the ground we know that this barangay captain is allied with the Marcoses, here online it's quite difficult to determine if who's paid for, who is actually hired in the payroll of the campaign, and who is a citizen-led campaign. So or initiative. So that's the difference of these intermediaries. And more or less, the thing with these intermediaries, because they're unknown, they're below the radar, they really can do dirty work for the politician. I remember Marcos Jr. saying, I don't do negative campaigning, so somebody else will do it for him, right? This is
Yes.
exactly the work of these intermediaries. I keep my hands clean, and they can say I did the negative campaigning, but somebody else did it for me.
Thank you. Professor Cleve, I got a question from a reader on Twitter. I'd like to direct it to you. It's from Azarkazam. And he or she, I actually don't know, um, has a question about gaming the surveys and using this information to game the surveys. So on March 14, 2022, Azarkazam wrote, I think the survey taking fake news release are coordinated to influence the results. So on that day, March 14, uh, this is what was written. Right now, recent fake news include VP Lenny married at 15, camp of VP Lenny, Senator Kiko are infiltrated by NPAs. Marcos Jr.'s rally in Las Piñas was joined by 500,000 people. Have we in fact reached that point where operators are so savvy that they are able to insert or integrate disinformation campaigns into the survey cycle?
Yeah. I think I wouldn't be surprised if disinformation operators now also consider the survey cycle as part of their considerations. Because prior to the online disinformation campaigns, we also know that on the ground, different campaigns would also adjust the kind of like campaign activities that they would do depending on the survey cycle, especially those of the biggest survey firms, those surveys done by the most reputable firms, right? You should strategically do some of your activities in these particular dates so that it would be captured by the survey, right? And if you have access to the survey dates, especially if you've if you've done if you've commissioned a survey, or if you know people in the political world. You I think it's quite easy to get information as to the dates of the survey. So I wouldn't really be surprised if they're doing this. So I think because of this, I think it's very important now that at the start of usually if you read the survey reports, the entirety of the technical report, they would usually start with some of the biggest political news or political developments, right, to contextualize the results of the survey, right? But I think it's also important now because of this organized disinformation campaign, especially during election time, that we also consider integrating questions really on the information environment of our voters and the respondents that they're asking, right? I mean, we can't really do, and I mean, if you're a survey firm, you can't really do anything about with the fact that if people are reading fake news, then they're gonna be making. At least we can expect that they're gonna be making their decisions or responses to your survey according to the information that they consume, including the fake news, right? But if we also include the standard set of questions that would assess the information environment that they have, then at least we can always contextualize the survey numbers according to this election information environment. And that's something that I think I would like to see to be conducted by survey firms, especially, as I've said, we now do surveys, election surveys, at a different age. It's in the age of organized disinformation campaigns.
Thank you. Let me ask my last questions. I'd like to ask Professor Fatima about the youth and how they perceive or fight back against disinformation. But maybe I can start first with Professor Cleve, because you already talked about surveys. Professor Cleve, in the dim light of actual, persistent, organized disinformation, how should we read surveys?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we should still read surveys the way that we have been reading it before, in the sense that we have to be as critical as possible in interpreting the surveys. Context is very important, including on the methodology of these surveys. But I think we're talking about the standard surveys done by the most reputable firms here. As I've said in my previous in my response to your previous question, I think it's important that surveys now do not just ask about election preference, but also about the election information environment. So, for example, we have this SWS survey saying that almost 7 out of 10 voters say that they're worried about fake news and that they have encountered fake news. And if most of that's the majority, if the majority of the Filipinos are saying that they're worried about fake news and that they've encountered fake news, then they're definitely taking the fake news also into consideration when they're making their voting decisions. And that's part of the problem, because we couldn't really, the survey firms, in regards to them, they couldn't really disregard respondents who are exposed to fake news, right? Because that would be a methodological problem. But I think the least that they could do is to actually help those who combat fake news, those who combat disinformation, to get more guidance on where fake news is present, what kinds of fake news are really resonating on the ground, for example, and what kinds of fake news are being used by voters in making their election preferences.
Thank you. And for Professor Fatima, the younger generations of voters, the millennials and the Gen Z, are digital and social media natives. I mean, they grew up in this environment. I want to talk about them and disinformation. Are they part of the problem or part of the solution?
Oh, difficult thing to answer. Could be controversial. I think that disinformation campaigns, because they look like ordinary posts out there, it's quite difficult to even ask somebody young who is savvy with technology to determine, what's disinformation and what's not, because it is increasingly entrenched. It is, it's camouflaged with the rest of what we see online. But I think a lot of young people nowadays really are very much hyper aware of this information being an existential crisis in their existence in the youth society. So I think that there are a lot of efforts to participate in efforts to fight disinformation. Although I would argue these efforts could be community led, like aiding journalists to do fact checking, reporting these bogus content and where they're circulating. They even create their own content that's quite creative. It's not the journalistic format that we're used to in fact checking. They use the vernacular of the platforms to do so. But ultimately, I would have this antithesis. It's not really the role of the audience to fight disinformation, while there are literacy campaigns to help them be sharper in their judgment of discerning content online. I think the problem is so systemic that anyone could be a victim, except that more people are more vulnerable than others. So I can speak for the youth, but definitely this is something that surrounds them and something that I think they will think of as an inherent part of the political landscape nowadays.
Thank you. It's 8:46, but I cannot resist one last quick question. What are your thoughts on TikTok? Maybe Professor Cleve and then Professor Fatima.
Yeah, I just want to add quickly to what Fatima said. I don't want to pass up this opportunity. De La Salle University's Institute of Governance did a survey on the ability of young people to spot fake news. And the result is actually interesting because it showed that this is based on a survey of young people in NCR and Calabarzon. And they actually overestimated, most of them, I think around 80%, if I'm not mistaken, overestimated their ability to spot fake news. So that's probably something to consider, that because we celebrate Gen Zs and millennials are digital natives, and and they know their way in the ins and outs of social media, they may be overestimating actually their ability to spot fake news than other generations na hindi immersed in the social media world to begin with. So they probably have lesser trust on anything coming from the social media, right? We could also see it that way. On the question of TikTok, I think it's a platform that's also emerging to be really an important an important platform for election campaigns, right? Especially among young people. And I've seen that the way that these information campaigns are also run, the way that it is run in other social media platforms, that also the same way that it is run on TikTok, but definitely it's adjusted to how the community works and the logic of being on TikTok. For example, people were talking about that, it's worrying that young people nowadays are, they are playing the Bagong Lipunan song of the martial law period. But I think it's been a couple of months before when I first saw it and heard it on TikTok, that some of the nano influencers there are, they were playing the same song, right? Without really providing context, without really any political discussion. And I think that's something that's really insidious about it, because now this information functions particularly on TikTok, without even, appearing to be political or to be partisan. You just have to seed particular sounds, you have to just seed particular images, and that's really something that's happening on TikTok. But I know that Fatima has more to say about this.
Thank you. Professor Fatima?
In fact, I don't have a lot to say because TikTok is quite a difficult platform to study. Empirically, there are not a lot of tools to use to extract TikTok content. So researchers are quite limited in how they can study TikTok. But what I can say is that it's TikTok, since its format is short form video, there's really no space for evidence or research. It's like a micro dose of disinformation. A couple of seconds that this is the lie that I spread to you, and on top of that microdosing, it makes this information cool all of a sudden. It has songs and layout and filters. So I think that's also a factor here. If TikTok as a platform is cool and it has become a space for this information all of a sudden becomes cool too.
Thank you. Thank you for your research, for your insights, for your time, and also for staying over time. Professor Fatima Gaw and Professor Cleve Arguelles, I'm very grateful for the time you've spent here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. I've been following the show, so looking forward to more episodes.
Thank you. That's a lot to unpack. Unlike in 2016, when very few had even an inkling that this information was changing Philippine electoral politics, in 2022, we know that disinformation is rampant, constant, resonant, and effective. It is changing the game even in the middle of play. So we will return to this topic precisely because the democratic project is in danger. But for now, for tonight, that's it for us. Join us again next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Follow us closely on the campaign trail because it isn't just elections as usual. This is John Nery. Good night.